I am Julian, and I am 34 years old. 3 years ago, my own parents tried to extort me for $35,000 by faking a medical emergency to save my older brother's life. While I was sitting in my dark apartment, absolutely exhausted from a brutal 70-hour work week, my mother called me in the middle of the night and screamed, "Your brother's in the hospital. Send $35,000 now or he'll die." She demanded I wire my hard-earned savings immediately, treating me like a personal ATM machine, while my golden child brother was perfectly fine, waiting at home to cash in on my panic. They humiliated me online and dragged my name through the mud in front of dozens of our relatives and family friends. But there is one thing they didn't know. I had already hired a shark of a lawyer, and I uncovered a massive real estate fraud they had secretly committed under my name years ago. And now, they are the ones begging for mercy while their perfect little lives crumble to the ground. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their web of lies, hit that like button if you believe in justice. And don't forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's go back to the night everything started to unravel. The text hit my phone at exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I know the exact time because I had just finished reviewing a massive stack of quarterly financial reports for my firm, and my eyes were burning. The harsh blue light of my phone's screen cut through the absolute darkness of my bedroom, illuminating the ceiling. I was lying there, trying to force my brain to shut down, when the notification chimed. I reached over, my joints aching from sitting in an office chair for 14 hours straight, and squinted at the screen. The name at the very top of the message was Felix, my older brother. Just seeing his name pop up on my screen sent a jolt of ice straight through my chest. My stomach tightened into a familiar, defensive knot. Felix and I had not spoken a single word to each other in 6 months. The absolute last time we saw each other. He had stood right here in the middle of my living room, pacing back and forth, practically demanding that I co-sign a massive commercial business loan to save his failing restaurant. Felix always had these grandiose, larger-than-life dreams, but he possessed absolutely zero work ethic to back them up. He wanted the title of a restaurant owner without putting in the grueling hours required to actually run a kitchen. When he had come to me, waving a stack of poorly organized financial projections and unpaid vendor invoices, I had sat him down and looked at the numbers. They were a disaster. He was bleeding money. When I flat out told him no, explaining that attaching my name to his sinking ship would ruin my own credit and jeopardize my career, he unleashed a verbal barrage I will never forget. He didn't argue the numbers. He attacked my character. He called me a selfish corporate robot. He called me dead weight to the family. He screamed that I owed him this because we were blood. When I stood up and asked him to leave my apartment, he slammed the door so hard the framed pictures on my hallway wall rattled. So, reading this new midnight text from him 6 months later, I expected more of the same entitled rage. I opened the message. It read, "Hope you die alone, you pathetic loser. At least I have a family who loves me. You'll never be anything but a bitter, jealous failure." I lay there in the dark, reading the words over and over. I did not cry. I did not throw my phone across the room in a fit of rage. I didn't even feel the urge to type out a furious reply defending myself. Instead, I felt a strange, cold calm wash over me. It was the kind of heavy, settling peace you feel when a long, exhausting storm finally breaks and you realize the house is still standing. I had spent my entire life absorbing Felix's tantrums, buffering his failures, and making myself smaller so his ego could take up all the oxygen in the room. I simply did not have the energy to care about his fragile pride anymore. I calmly set my phone face down on the nightstand, switched off the bedside lamp, closed my eyes, and went back to sleep. I truly wish I could tell you that his text message was the worst part of the night. If it had ended there, it would have just been another sad chapter in a broken brotherhood. But what happened just a few hours later shattered whatever fragile illusion of family I had left clinging to my heart. My phone started ringing at 3:18 a.m. The vibration buzzed angrily against the wooden nightstand. I jolted awake, my heart hammering against my ribs. I let it ring 4 times. I just stared at the glowing screen in the pitch blackness of my room. Anyone who has ever received a phone call at 3 in the morning knows that no good news ever arrives in the dead of night. Midnight calls are for car crashes, heart attacks, and final goodbyes. The caller ID said it was my mother, Barbara. I took a deep, steadying breath, steeling myself for whatever disaster Felix had caused now, and swiped my thumb across the glass to answer. "Your brother's in the hospital." My mother's voice cracked the absolute second the line connected. Her tone sounded frantic, high-pitched, and breathless, but even in my sleep-addled state, I could hear a strange, rehearsed tremor to her panic. It sounded like an actress reading lines she hadn't fully memorized. "He needs surgery immediately," she continued, not even pausing to see if I was awake. "They say it's critical. We need $35,000 by morning or they won't operate." My heart, which I honestly thought had hardened against them a long time ago, still managed to drop right into my stomach. Blood pounded in my ears. Despite everything, despite the cruel text message just hours ago, he was still my brother. I sat up slowly in the dark, throwing the heavy comforter off my legs, running a cold hand over my face. I asked her which hospital they were at, keeping my voice as calm, low, and detached as humanly possible. I was already mentally calculating the drive time to the nearest trauma centers in their city. "That doesn't matter right now," she snapped back instantly. Her supposed blind panic instantly shifted into sharp, biting irritation. It was a tonal whiplash that made my blood run cold. "If your son is dying on an operating table, you tell his brother where you are. You don't get annoyed by the question. We need you to wire the money," she demanded, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "Your father and I don't have that kind of cash liquid, and Felix's insurance won't cover this specific procedure. You're the only one who can help him, Julian. You have to do this." I pushed back. I planted my feet on the cold hardwood floor. I asked her exactly what happened. What kind of injury costs exactly $35,000 up front in the middle of the night? She hesitated for a fraction of a second before claiming he had suffered a terrible accident. She said he fell down a long flight of stairs at his house, hit his abdomen, and had severe internal bleeding. She aggressively insisted that the doctors told her he could die by morning if I did not pay for the surgery tonight. I pulled the phone away from my ear for a few seconds. The screen illuminated the dark room. I looked at the lock screen. The timestamp from Felix's hateful text was sitting right there. It was barely 4 hours old. A man with severe, life-threatening internal bleeding from a massive fall does not spend his evenings sitting around typing out perfectly punctuated, spiteful paragraphs about how pathetic his younger brother is. The math did not add up. The timeline was physically impossible. I brought the phone back to my ear. "No," I said quietly into the receiver. "Just no." "What?" My mother's voice cracked again, and this time, the shock radiating through the phone was entirely real. She had never expected defiance. "Julian, you can't be serious. This is your brother. Your only brother. He is dying." "I'm very serious," I replied. The words came out of my mouth much colder, much heavier than I had even intended. I wasn't just rejecting her demand for money. I was rejecting the entire foundation of our relationship. "I'm going back to sleep now. Good night." I hit the red button and hung up the phone before she could scream another word. The silence in my apartment was deafening for exactly 3 seconds. Then, the phone immediately started ringing again. The screen lit up with my father's number this time. I didn't even look at it. I silenced the ringer, plugged the cord into the charging port, turned the phone face down on the wood, and climbed back into bed. I pulled the heavy comforter right back over my shoulders, burying my face in the pillow. To my absolute, profound surprise, sleep came much easier than I ever expected. My conscience was clear. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness take over, completely unaware of the absolute hurricane of toxicity and vengeance that was preparing to obliterate my life the very next morning. I woke up the next morning to bright, unforgiving sunlight streaming through the gaps in my blinds. I felt remarkably rested, a strange physical lightness in my limbs. But the moment my hand reached out and grabbed my phone off the nightstand, reality hit me like a runaway freight train. I had 73 missed calls. I had 42 unread text messages. It was a staggering testament to how little my own family actually knew the man I had become. They genuinely thought they could bully me into compliance through sheer volume and relentless harassment. I did not open the messages immediately. I forced myself to get out of bed, walk into my kitchen, and make my morning coffee. I measured the grounds, poured the hot water, and savoring the quiet, methodical ritual. I needed that armor, that caffeine, before I looked at the screen. When I finally sat down at the kitchen island and opened my inbox, it was a whirlwind of absolute, unhinged toxicity. There were tearful, emotionally manipulative audio messages from my mother, sobbing into the microphone about how I was breaking her heart. There were icy, threatening texts from my father, Richard, telling me that I was a disgrace to the family name and that my selfishness would ruin me. Felix's wife, Clara, had sent me massive, sprawling paragraphs about what a horrible, soulless monster I was. She claimed she was sitting by his hospital bed, holding his hand, wondering how anyone could let their own flesh and blood perish over a few dollars. Even cousins I had not heard from in a decade suddenly had very strong, very loud opinions about my moral character. An uncle I had spoken to exactly twice at family funerals sent me a long email informing me that my greed was a sin and that I was going to burn in hell. I sat there, sipping my black coffee, reading the vitriol. I didn't reply to a single one. I simply swiped left and deleted every single message. To understand how I could sit in a quiet kitchen, drinking coffee while my entire extended family called me a murderer, you have to deeply understand the toxic dynamic I grew up in. In our childhood home, Felix was the sun, the moon, and the stars. The rest of us were just lucky to orbit his gravity. He was the golden child. He was the handsome, charismatic, naturally gifted athlete who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. I, on the other hand, was the quiet, studious backup plan. I was the safety net. I learned very early on to make myself as small, invisible, and low maintenance as possible. I realized quickly that needing anything from my parents, whether it was a new pair of shoes for school, help with a science project, or just a few words of encouragement, only led to deep, biting disappointment. Everything was always about what Felix needed, what Felix wanted, and how Felix was feeling. I clearly remember Thanksgiving dinners where Felix would confidently declare he wanted both turkey legs. My mother would just smile brightly, carve them off, and hand them over to his plate, turning to me and saying that I was a growing boy who needed to eat more vegetables anyway. It was a small thing, but it was the blueprint for my entire existence. But the real turning point, the singular moment I realized exactly what my true role in the family was, happened when I was 19 years old. Felix had just managed to graduate from a very expensive, very prestigious private university, mostly by scraping by with C- grades that my parents paid tutors thousands of dollars to secure. To celebrate his completely mediocre achievement, my parents took out a loan and bought him a brand new Porsche. It was shiny, fast, obscenely expensive, and completely unnecessary for a 22-year-old with no job prospects. 2 weeks after he proudly accepted the keys, Felix went to a massive frat party, got incredibly drunk, and wrapped that beautiful, expensive sports car around a concrete telephone pole on a suburban street. Thank God nobody was seriously hurt, but the car was completely totaled. It was a twisted pile of metal. I was working graveyard shifts at a local Walmart at the time. I was spending my nights stocking heavy boxes of dog food and detergent until 3 in the morning just to pay for my tuition at a local community college. I had been saving every single penny in a college fund I managed myself, living off ramen noodles and cheap coffee. My parents had firmly promised to help me with my final 2 years of tuition when I transferred to a state university. The morning after Felix's crash, I came home exhausted, smelling like cardboard and cheap warehouse dust. My father was waiting for me. He sat me down at the kitchen table. He did not look apologetic. He did not look embarrassed by his older son's reckless behavior. He looked stern, commanding, and cold. He told me that family protects family. He told me that Felix was facing serious legal trouble for the property damage and the DUI, and that he needed top-tier legal representation, plus they had to cover the massive insurance deductible that the policy wouldn't pay because Felix was intoxicated. Then, he looked me dead in the eye, folded his hands on the table, and said they were taking the money they had promised for my tuition to cover Felix's mess. He also demanded I empty the savings account I had built from my Walmart paychecks to contribute to the lawyer fees. When I protested, when I literally begged them not to sacrifice my entire future, my education, and my hard work for his drunken mistake, my mother walked into the kitchen. She looked at me with deep disappointment. She told me I needed to learn financial responsibility. She said Felix was going through a very hard time and needed our unconditional support. They literally took the foundation of my future to pave over my brother's reckless disaster. That was the exact day I stopped being a son and started being a financial resource. I paid for the rest of my college by taking on crippling student loans and working 2 jobs until I thought I would collapse. I built my career from the ground up, fighting tooth and nail for every promotion, and aggressively negotiating every salary increase. I lived frugally. I maxed out my 401k every year. I bought a modest but secure apartment. I built a life of total independence because I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I had absolutely no safety net to fall back on. Meanwhile, Felix drifted from one failed business venture to another, always bailed out by my parents. When he got married to Clara, they paid for a lavish, over-the-top wedding they could not afford. And when his restaurant started failing 6 months ago, they came knocking on my door, expecting me to co-sign a loan that would have financially ruined me forever. When I finally looked them in the eye and said no, they acted like I had driven a knife into their backs. So, sitting in my kitchen that Wednesday morning, looking at 73 missed calls on my phone screen, I felt nothing but a deep, resonant exhaustion. I put the phone in my pocket. I put on my best tailored suit, grabbed my leather briefcase, and drove to work. My firm was in the middle of a massive quarterly review, and I absolutely could not afford to be distracted by their circus. I sat in the morning meeting, staring blankly at the whiteboard in the conference room while a senior colleague discussed a major corporate account. My manager, seeing my rigid posture, gently asked if everything was okay. I looked at him, gave a dry, humorless laugh, and said it was just a minor family emergency, but they would get over it. I kept my face like stone. But the storm was not staying contained to my personal cell phone. At exactly 2:30 p.m., the heavy black office phone on my desk rang. The receptionist's voice came through the speaker, sounding slightly confused. She said she was transferring a call from someone claiming to be my mother, who said it was a matter of life and death. Out of sheer, morbid curiosity, I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. "The hospital is threatening to discharge Felix without the surgery," my mother wailed into the phone, skipping any normal greeting, her voice echoing loudly in my quiet office. "They're saying he can recover at home with pain medication and monitoring. Your father and I are trying to convince them how serious this is, but they won't listen unless we can guarantee payment right this second." A slow, wry smile touched my lips. I looked out the window of my office at the city skyline. The lie was so incredibly, pathetically poorly constructed. American hospitals do not discharge patients with severe, life-threatening internal bleeding just because they cannot pay up front. That is a massive malpractice lawsuit waiting to happen. "Sounds like he'll be fine then," I said calmly, my voice flat and completely devoid of empathy. "How can you be so cruel?" she screamed, the volume forcing me to pull the phone slightly away from my ear. "This is your brother lying in a hospital bed suffering. And you won't even help him. The same brother who texted me last night hoping I die alone?" I shot back, my words laced with pure, unyielding steel. That brother. There was a long, heavy, suffocating silence on the line. Seconds stretched between us, thick with the realization that I had caught her in her own timeline. "He didn't mean that," she finally stammered, her voice losing its aggressive edge, replaced by nervous backpedaling. "He was just upset. You know how he gets when he's emotional and stressed." "I do know," I confirmed, my tone dropping to a dangerous quiet. And that's exactly why I'm not sending a single dime. Ever. We raised you better than this, she said, her voice dropping into that familiar, venomous guilt-tripping register she had perfected over decades. Your father is so disappointed in the man you've become. He can barely look at photos of you anymore. Tell Dad I said hello, I replied. I hung up the phone. I immediately picked it back up, called the IT department, and instructed them to permanently block my parents' and brother's phone numbers from the entire corporate office network. I thought that shutting down the communication channels would give me peace. I had absolutely no idea that they were about to escalate this from a private family dispute into a public execution. By the time I drove my car into my parking garage and got home that evening, the attacks had forcefully moved from my private inbox directly to the public square. I opened my laptop on the kitchen counter, took a sip of water, and logged onto Facebook. My timeline was an absolute war zone. Felix had posted a massive, rambling, dramatically punctuated status update about his heartless, corporate greed-obsessed younger brother, who point-blank refused to save his life. He had attached a photo of himself sitting up in a hospital bed. He was wearing a faded, ugly hospital gown, looking incredibly pale, tragic, and weak. He wrote long, agonizing paragraphs about betrayal, about how blood is supposed to be thicker than water, and how he was actively praying for my soul because the greed of money had entirely corrupted my humanity. The comment section below the photo exploded. It was a feeding frenzy of outrage. Strangers, mutual friends of friends, people from my old high school who hadn't spoken to me in 15 years, and family members I barely recognized were piling on with absolute venom. They called me a sociopath. They called me a greedy corporate suit who cared more about his stock portfolio than his dying sibling. Several people tagged me directly in the comments, making absolutely sure my name was highlighted in blue, forcing me to see their outrage. Clara, his devoted wife, was right there in the trenches, replying to every single comment. She was thanking people profusely for their prayers and emphasizing how devastating it was to sit by a hospital bed, wondering how her husband's own flesh and blood could let him perish over a few dollars in a bank account. I sat at my kitchen island, watching the red notification bell on my screen light up over and over again. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. I didn't engage. I didn't type out a furious defense. I didn't try to explain the timeline or the text message. I just clicked the little 3 dots on the corner of the post, reported it for severe harassment, and closed my laptop. 3 long, agonizing days passed in this bizarre, tense reality. I went to work. I came home. I ignored the noise. The calls and messages to my personal phone gradually decreased as my family finally realized, perhaps for the first time in my 34 years of life, that I was absolutely not going to break. Felix eventually posted a miraculous, heavily filtered update saying he was recovering slowly at home. He claimed that God had blessed him with survival despite having such a terrible, unsupportive brother, and that he would never, ever forget who abandoned him in his darkest hour. I bought a new pair of expensive running shoes, increased my morning jogging distance by 2 miles, and focused entirely on my physical health and my career. I thought the drama was slowly bleeding out. Then, 2 weeks later, the dam broke, and the truth finally leaked out. It came from my Aunt Beatrice, my mother's older sister. Beatrice and my mother had maintained a very strained, highly competitive, and deeply passive-aggressive relationship for decades. They only tolerated each other at weddings and funerals. She called me on a Friday evening from a landline number I didn't immediately recognize. I need to tell you something very important about Felix's hospital visit, Beatrice said, completely skipping any polite small talk. Your parents are lying to you, Julian. I stopped chopping vegetables for my dinner, set the heavy chef's knife down on the cutting board, and leaned against the marble counter. Lying how? I asked, my voice tight. The whole thing was a staged production, Beatrice said, a note of grim satisfaction in her voice. Felix went to the emergency room complaining of chest pains. The triage nurses ran a bunch of tests, did an EKG, and found absolutely nothing wrong with his heart. They diagnosed him with a mild panic attack, gave him some cheap anti-anxiety medication, and sent him home after sitting in a bed for 6 hours. The total hospital bill was $800. A massive wave of cold, hard certainty washed over me, chilling me to the bone. "And the 35,000? I asked, gripping the edge of the counter. "Your mother decided to turn his little anxiety episode into an elaborate, dramatic scheme to get a lump sum of money out of you," Beatrice explained, her voice practically dripping with disgust. "Felix and Clara are 3 months behind on their mortgage payments. The bank is preparing to foreclose. They're about to lose the house. They needed a massive cash injection immediately, and they knew you wouldn't give them a dime if they just asked to pay their debts. So, Barbara invented a critical surgery." "How do you know all this for sure?" I asked, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the phone. "Because your idiot brother got drunk at a neighborhood barbecue last weekend and started bragging about it," Beatrice said, laughing sharply. "He told half the cul-de-sac that they almost got 35 grand out of his tightwad brother. But you were too stubborn to care if he died. He thought it was hilarious. Your mother was absolutely furious with him for running his mouth. But the damage was done. Several people heard him. I figured you deserved to know exactly what kind of snakes they really are." Beatrice wasn't telling me this out of the goodness of her heart. She loved having ammunition against my mother. 10 years ago, my mother had pulled a very similar stunt, claiming she needed emergency gallbladder surgery that actually turned out to be an elective cosmetic procedure, and she scammed Beatrice out of $12,000. Still, the information was solid gold. It validated every single boundary I had ever set. It proved that my gut instinct was flawlessly accurate. I thanked Beatrice profusely, hung up the phone, and let out a long, heavy, shuddering breath. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't cruel. I was just the designated mark in their family con game. I needed to clear my head, so the very next day, I agreed to meet my cousin Lucas for coffee. Lucas was my father's nephew, and growing up, he had always seemed like the only reasonable, level-headed person in the entire family. When he texted me saying he wanted to hear my side of the story regarding the hospital drama, I foolishly thought I had an ally. We sat at a quiet corner table at a busy downtown cafe. I didn't tell him everything Beatrice had revealed, but I vented. I let my guard down. I told him how utterly exhausted I was by the constant manipulation. I told him I was doing very well at work, that I had just been promoted and moved to a new corporate building on the 14th floor of the financial district, and that I just wanted to be left alone in peace. Lucas nodded sympathetically, his eyes full of what looked like genuine concern. He bought my coffee. He patted my shoulder. He told me he completely understood my perspective and that I had every right to protect my peace of mind. I left that coffee shop feeling a tiny, fragile sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in my bloodline was toxic. Less than 24 hours later, that hope was violently and permanently ripped away from me. It was a Thursday afternoon. The office was buzzing with activity. I came down to the massive, marble-floored lobby of my office building to grab an espresso from the downstairs kiosk before a major client meeting. As the brass elevator doors slid open, I stepped out into the busy, echoing atrium. And there, standing right next to the main security desk, harassing the guard, was my father, Richard. He looked significantly older than I remembered. His hair had gone completely, starkly gray since I last saw him 18 months ago at a terrible, argument-filled Christmas dinner. But his eyes still held that same demanding, authoritarian, furious glare. My stomach plummeted straight to the floor. I hadn't given my parents my new office address. The only person in the entire extended family who knew exactly where I worked now was Lucas. The betrayal stung, sharp, bitter, and deep. Lucas hadn't been an ally. He hadn't wanted to hear my side of the story. He was a scout, a spy sent to gather intel on my location. The security guard looked over at me, holding the lobby phone in his hand. "Sir, do you want us to remove this gentleman?" he asked, clearly sensing the heavy tension radiating from my father. I cleared my throat, forcing my heart rate to slow down. "No, I'll handle this myself," I said, stepping out of the elevator bay. I walked slowly over to my father. He stood up straight, squaring his broad shoulders, his expression a volatile mixture of deep anger and calculated exhaustion. "We need to talk," he demanded, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. "No, we don't," I replied instantly, keeping my voice low, flat, and perfectly steady. "Your mother is devastated," he hissed, stepping closer to me, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. "She cries every single night because of what you've done to this family." I crossed my arms over my chest, planting my feet firmly on the polished marble floor. "What I've done? I didn't fake a medical emergency to extort money from anyone." His face immediately flushed a deep, ugly, angry red. Felix was genuinely scared. He thought something was seriously wrong with his heart. "Your mother was just trying to help him get the best care possible. By lying about needing $35,000 for a surgery that never happened?" I shot back, my voice gaining an edge. "That's not helping, Dad. That's fraud." "Don't talk to me about fraud," he barked loudly, drawing the immediate attention of several corporate employees walking through the lobby. "You've defrauded this family of basic human decency. Felix needed support, and you completely abandoned him. Felix needed $800 for an ER visit that found absolutely nothing wrong," I said coldly, stating the facts like a prosecutor dismantling a weak defense. "He got anxiety medication and went home. Those are the facts, whether you want to acknowledge them or not." My father stepped even closer, lowering his voice into that old, familiar tone of psychological manipulation he used to break me down when I was a teenager. "You've always been jealous of your brother, always trying to make him look bad because he has what you don't. A loving wife, a family, people who actually care about him." Something cold, heavy, and almost peaceful finally settled permanently in my chest. The very last string holding my emotional attachment to this man snapped. "Is that what you really think? That I'm jealous?" I asked. "What else would explain this absolute cruelty?" he demanded. "Your own brother reaches out for help and you turn your back. What kind of person does that? The kind who is tired of being treated like an ATM machine by people who spent my entire life telling me I'm not good enough," I said quietly. I didn't yell. I didn't break down. I just looked at him as if he were a complete stranger. "You should leave now. I have work to do. If you walk away right now, you are walking away from this family permanently," my father threatened, pointing a thick finger directly at my chest. "Your mother and I won't tolerate this disrespect any longer." I turned around and headed straight toward the elevator bank, my back ramrod straight. "You haven't tolerated me for years, Dad. This just makes it official." His voice followed me across the echoing lobby, sharp, cutting, and desperate to land one final blow. "Don't come crying to us when you end up alone with nobody who cares whether you live or die." I pressed the elevator button and waited, keeping my back to him entirely until the heavy metal doors opened. Several colleagues in the lobby were staring at us in shocked silence. I truly didn't care. The doors closed on my father's angry, red, retreating face, and I rode back up to the 14th floor in total silence. It was over, but the war they were about to wage on my life and my career had only just begun. If my father honestly thought that showing up unannounced at my workplace and throwing a public tantrum in the lobby was going to intimidate me into submission, he fundamentally misunderstood the man I had become. I was no longer the frightened 19-year-old kid working at Walmart, begging to keep his college fund. I was a grown man who knew my worth. But my family didn't stop at lobby ambushes. When physical intimidation failed to break me, they moved seamlessly into full-scale professional sabotage. 2 days after the incident with my father, Felix and his wife Clara decided to aggressively escalate the harassment. They bypassed me entirely and went straight for the jugular, my career. Clara, who clearly had too much free time in her foreclosed home, created several fake LinkedIn profiles using stock photos and fake corporate titles. She started systematically messaging my colleagues, my department supervisors, and even a few external clients I was connected with. The messages she sent were completely unhinged. She introduced herself as a concerned citizen. She claimed, in writing, that I had stolen money intended for my dying brother's medical care. She suggested that the company should severely reconsider employing a senior financial analyst with such questionable ethics, complete lack of moral character, and sociopathic tendencies. It didn't take long for the radioactive fallout to reach the very top of the corporate ladder. I was called into the massive corner office of my CEO, Victor. Victor was a fiercely intelligent, no-nonsense executive who valued absolute discretion, flawless performance, and corporate stability above all else. Walking into his office, feeling the plush carpet under my shoes, my stomach tied itself into tight, painful knots. I had worked tirelessly for years to build my professional reputation in this industry, and my degenerate brother was actively destroying it with a keyboard from his living room couch. Victor sat behind his massive mahogany desk. He didn't smile. He simply turned his sleek silver laptop screen toward me so I could read it. It displayed one of Clara's crazy, defamatory messages sent directly to his inbox. "Julian, I know this is garbage," Victor said, his voice calm, deep, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "Your performance here is impeccable. Your numbers are flawless. But I need you to make this stop immediately. It's reflecting poorly on the whole department, and some of our external clients are getting uncomfortable with the noise." I didn't panic. I didn't cry or beg for my job. I had anticipated this exact kind of scorched earth tactic. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, neatly organized physical folder. It contained perfectly printed screenshots of Felix's original text wishing me dead with timestamps. It contained the call logs of the 3:18 a.m. extortion attempt from my mother. It contained the frantic, threatening text messages. And most importantly, it contained a printed, sworn email statement from my Aunt Beatrice detailing the exact nature of the $800 hospital bill and the mortgage crisis Felix was facing. I laid the folder out on his desk right next to the laptop. Victor put on his reading glasses, leaned forward, and reviewed the documents carefully, page by page. I stood there in silence, watching his grim expression slowly shift from corporate annoyance to absolute, wide-eyed disbelief. "Do you want to press criminal charges?" Victor asked, looking up at me, taking off his glasses. "I want them to leave me alone," I said, my voice tight with months of accumulated exhaustion. "If aggressive legal action accomplishes that, then yes, do whatever is necessary." "Let me talk to our corporate legal department," Victor replied, closing the folder and tapping it with his pen. "We can send a severe cease and desist letter on behalf of the company itself, since they are actively targeting you through our corporate network and harassing our employees. Nobody threatens my team. Period." A massive, almost imperceptible sigh of relief left my lungs. The corporate machine was stepping in to protect its asset. The cease and desist letter arrived at Felix and Clara's house 5 days later via certified mail. It was printed on heavy, expensive corporate letterhead, signed by 3 highly aggressive corporate attorneys, promising swift, immediate, and financially devastating legal action for defamation, libel, and tortious interference with business relations if the harassment did not cease immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. They were bullies, and like all bullies, they cowered the second someone with actual power punched back. But I knew a single corporate letter wasn't enough to protect myself permanently. I needed my own armor. The psychological toll of the last month was heavy, and I needed to ensure I never fell back into their traps again. I started seeing a high-end therapist named Naomi. She was sharp, incredibly insightful, and didn't let me get away with minimizing my own trauma or making excuses for them. During our intense weekly sessions, we painstakingly unpacked the deep-seated guilt I carried, the guilt of surviving the family dynamic, the guilt of being successful while my brother failed miserably, the guilt of walking away from the people who gave me life. Naomi helped me clearly realize that my lack of sadness regarding the situation wasn't a defect in my character. It was a completely valid, healthy response to losing a family that only ever viewed me as a disposable asset. She helped me build ironclad emotional boundaries. Simultaneously, I hired a private, extremely ruthless family and financial lawyer. I needed to ensure that my assets, my bank accounts, my apartment, and my 401k were completely insulated from any future, desperate attempts my parents might make to sue me for elder support or whatever fabricated debt they could dream up to drain my resources. I sat in my lawyer's sleek downtown office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, drinking stale bottled water while he ran comprehensive, deep-dive background checks and credit reports on my social security number just to be absolutely safe. I thought it was just a formality, a way to sleep better at night. I was wrong. "Julian," the lawyer said, walking back into the conference room holding a stack of freshly printed papers. He did not look happy. His brow was furrowed, and his mouth was set in a grim line. "We have a massive problem." "What kind of problem?" I asked, my heart rate instantly accelerating, the familiar dread creeping back into my throat. He slid a heavy, stapled document across the polished conference table. "Are you aware that there is a second mortgage taken out on a commercial property entirely in your name?" he asked, tapping the paper. "A property you apparently purchased 5 years ago?" I stared blankly at the paper. I pulled it closer. It was a real estate property deed and a corresponding massive commercial bank loan agreement. My name was clearly printed at the top. My signature was scrawled at the bottom. But it wasn't my handwriting. It was a close forgery, but it wasn't mine. I looked at the property address listed on the deed. The blood completely drained from my face, leaving me cold and dizzy. It was the exact commercial space where Felix had opened his failed, bankrupt restaurant. My parents hadn't just bailed Felix out with their own money. They had forged my signature to secure the massive commercial loan that funded his disastrous business venture. They had secretly tied a massive, 6-figure financial anchor directly around my neck, gambling my entire financial future on Felix's inevitable failure, without ever telling me a single word. I sat back heavily in the leather chair, staring at the fraudulent signature, the room spinning slightly around me. I thought the $35,000 hospital scam was the absolute worst they could do. I thought the fake LinkedIn profiles and the public humiliation were the height of their cruelty. I thought I had seen the bottom of their depravity. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. The real war hadn't even started yet. I sat in the cold, hypermodern conference room of my lawyer's downtown office, staring at the fraudulent commercial real estate deed resting on the polished mahogany table. The silence in the room was so heavy it felt like physical pressure against my eardrums. My own parents, the people who had brought me into this world, the people who had demanded I hand over my hard-earned college fund to save my reckless brother, had secretly forged my signature to secure a massive commercial loan. They had anchored my entire financial future to Felix's doomed restaurant venture without a single shred of hesitation. My lawyer, a relentless and incredibly sharp man named Harrison, broke the suffocating silence. He leaned forward in his leather chair, tapping a silver pen against his yellow legal pad. He explained that discovering this forgery was an absolute fluke. "We only caught it because we ran a deep-dive forensic credit check to protect my current assets from any potential eldercare lawsuits my parents might try to leverage against me." Harrison looked me dead in the eye and laid out the brutal reality of the situation. He told me that if Felix defaulted on that commercial property, and given his disastrous track record, it was only a matter of time before the restaurant went bankrupt. The federal bank would come directly after me. They would garnish my corporate salary. They would seize my investment portfolios. They would liquidate the modest apartment I had worked 70-hour weeks to buy. My family had effectively planted a ticking financial time bomb right under my life, and they were just waiting for it to detonate. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't flip the table. The burning, chaotic anger I had felt during the fake hospital emergency completely evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, absolute glacial calm. The betrayal was so profound, so deeply calculated, that it completely severed the final biological ties I had to them. I looked up at Harrison and gave him one simple, highly specific instruction. I told him to hire the most ruthless forensic handwriting analyst in the state. I wanted ironclad, undeniable, court-admissible proof that my mother and father had forged my name on federal documents. I wanted the notary who stamped that fraudulent document aggressively investigated and subpoenaed. I wanted a loaded legal shotgun ready to fire the exact second they tried to ruin me. For the next 10 months, I lived in total, absolute silence. I completely vanished from their radar. I changed the locks on my apartment, upgraded my home security system with exterior cameras, and routed every single piece of my personal and financial mail through a private P.O. box on the other side of the city. My career, freed from the constant emotional drain of my family's manufactured crises, absolutely thrived. I focused entirely on my work, channeling every single ounce of that cold rage into brilliant corporate strategy. During those quiet months, the forensic handwriting report came back exactly as we expected. The expert analyst concluded with absolute medical and legal certainty that the signature on the commercial real estate deed was a blatant forgery. They identified the pen pressure, the loop structures, and the hesitation marks, confirming that the signature belonged to my mother, Barbara, actively attempting to mimic my handwriting. We had the smoking gun. We drafted a massive federal lawsuit for severe financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy, but I told Harrison to hold it in his desk. I wanted to wait. I knew my family's psychology better than anyone. I knew they could not survive without a host to leech off of. I knew the restaurant was hemorrhaging money. I knew they would eventually come back for more. And then, exactly 10 months after the fake emergency room scam, the actual universe stepped in with a dose of brutal, poetic irony. I was sitting at my office desk on a Wednesday afternoon, deeply reviewing a quarterly projection report, when my personal cell phone rang. The caller ID showed it was my Aunt Beatrice. I answered it immediately, knowing full well she would only break our unspoken silence if something massive had shifted in the family dynamic. Her voice was unusually quiet, completely lacking her normal sharp, gossipy edge. She told me my mother had suffered a massive, catastrophic stroke. There was no fake hospital bill this time. There was no staged panic or theatrical extortion attempt. It was a severe, paralyzing medical event. Beatrice told me that Barbara was rushed to the neurological intensive care unit and placed on life support for exactly 3 days before her organs began to shut down. The doctors told my father there was absolutely zero brain activity left. They pulled the plug that morning. Barbara was dead. I sat in my ergonomic office chair, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline, trying to pinpoint exactly what I felt in my chest. Society dictates that a son should fall to his knees, weep uncontrollably, and mourn the profound loss of his mother. But there was no agonizing heartbreak. There was a dull ache, perhaps mourning the loving, protective mother she should have been. But the overriding emotion pulsing through my veins was an uncomfortable, profound relief. The architect of my misery, the woman who had forged my name and tried to steal $35,000 from me, was permanently gone. Beatrice informed me that the funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday at a very large, incredibly upscale funeral home downtown. She told me Richard and Felix were orchestrating a massive, theatrical gathering, inviting every single extended relative, family friend, former neighbor, and distant cousin they could track down. They were turning her death into a grand production of grief. I had absolutely zero intention of going to mourn, but my analytical brain started connecting the dots. Bullies are deeply predictable when they are desperate. Richard and Felix were currently sitting on a failing commercial real estate loan, and the primary cosigner on the collateral, my mother, was dead. Without her income and her credit, they were losing their residential house. Felix's restaurant was drowning in unpaid vendor invoices. They needed a massive injection of money, and they needed a scapegoat to officially take over the crippling debt. I knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that they were going to use the intense emotional pressure of my mother's funeral to spring a massive trap on me. They would try to corner me in front of the entire extended family, weaponizing their fresh grief to force me into signing something. So I called Harrison immediately. I told him to print out 36 copies of the forensic handwriting report, 36 copies of the fake $800 hospital bill from 10 months ago, and 36 copies of the drafted federal lawsuit for criminal fraud. I put on my darkest, sharpest, custom-tailored suit. I packed the thick stacks of legal documents into a heavy, black leather professional portfolio. I was not going to a funeral to say a tearful goodbye. I was going to a corporate execution. I arrived at the funeral home on Saturday afternoon just as the formal service was concluding. The air inside the sprawling, opulent building was thick and suffocating, smelling heavily of white lilies and cheap, overly sweet perfume. I stood in the deep shadows at the very back of the heavily carpeted room, watching my father and Felix perform their roles for the captive crowd. Felix was weeping loudly, his shoulders shaking as he dabbed his eyes with a pristine white handkerchief, leaning heavily on his wife Clara, who looked appropriately tragic in a designer black dress. My father stood stoically by the incredibly expensive mahogany casket, shaking hands, accepting whispered condolences, and projecting the grim, noble aura of a devastated martyr. When the hour-long service finally ended, the funeral director, a tall man in a gray suit, stepped up to the podium and announced that the immediate family and close relatives were invited to a private reception room down the hall for a catered luncheon and a sharing of memories. I followed the slow-moving crowd of about 40 aunts, uncles, cousins, and close family friends. I kept my head down, staying near the back, completely unnoticed in the vast sea of black suits and dark dresses. The private reception room was incredibly large, featuring a long, polished mahogany table in the center, covered in expensive catered cold cuts, silver coffee urns, and crystal water glasses. The family filtered in slowly, taking their seats in the high-backed chairs, whispering to one another in hushed, somber tones. I did not take a seat. I stood near the heavy wooden double doors at the entrance, leaning slightly against the wall, my black leather portfolio held firmly and securely at my side. As soon as the room settled and everyone had a cup of coffee in their hands, my father, Richard, stood up at the absolute head of the table. He cleared his throat loudly, commanding the immediate attention of the entire room. He looked exhausted, the bags under his eyes prominent, but I could clearly see the calculated, predatory gleam shining in his dark eyes. He didn't know I was standing by the door yet. His gaze was focused entirely on the audience he was about to manipulate. "Family," Richard began, his voice wavering with perfectly calibrated emotional distress, echoing slightly in the large room. "Barbara loved all of you so incredibly much. She was the beating heart of this family. She gave everything she had, every ounce of her energy, to make sure we were protected, provided for, and kept together." He paused, lowering his head, letting a heavy, dramatic silence fill the room. Several aunts pulled out tissues and dabbed their eyes. Felix sniffled loudly for effect. "As most of you know," Richard continued, his tone shifting smoothly from profound grief to a harsh, judgmental, self-righteous edge, "the last year of Barbara's life was completely destroyed by unimaginable heartbreak. The sheer stress of being completely abandoned by her youngest son, Julian, took a massive, fatal toll on her physical health. When Felix was in the hospital last year, fighting for his very life against severe internal bleeding, Julian turned his back on us. He refused to help pay the critical medical bills. He left his own brother to die, and he left his mother to drown in sorrow." A low, angry murmur of disapproval rippled through the seated relatives. People shook their heads. I saw my cousin Lucas, the spy who had betrayed my office location, cross his arms in disgust. "But Barbara was an incredibly forgiving, loving woman," Richard said, his voice rising in volume as he reached into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick stack of legal papers and placed them firmly on the table in front of him. "Before she passed away, she told me she wanted to ensure that the family businesses and the property loans were fully consolidated. She wanted Julian to finally step up, to grow up, and take his rightful place in this family, to take over the financial responsibilities he so cruelly neglected. Felix's restaurant is a family legacy, and today, to honor Barbara's dying wish, I am publicly asking Julian to sign these transfer documents, to absorb the commercial real estate debt, and finally act like a real man." Felix stood up right next to him, placing a supportive hand on Richard's shoulder, looking incredibly brave and forgiving. "We just want to heal," Felix told the crowd, his voice shaking. We don't want any more fighting. We just want Julian to do the right thing for Mom. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the trap was breathtaking. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. They had gathered the entire extended family to use collective social pressure, public shaming, and weaponized grief to force me into legally adopting their fraudulent commercial loan. If I refused in front of everyone, I was the heartless monster who disrespected his grieving father and spat on his mother's dying wish. I took a deep, steadying breath, the cold, heavily air-conditioned air of the funeral home filling my lungs. I gripped the leather portfolio. I stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway, the hard heels of my dress shoes clicking sharply and loudly against the hardwood border of the room. "That is a beautifully tragic story, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the thick, somber atmosphere like a sharpened scythe. Every single head in the room snapped toward me with violent speed. The murmurs instantly died. The silence became absolute, ringing in my ears. My father's face went completely rigid, his eyes widening in shock. Felix physically took a step backward, bumping into his chair, his fake tears instantly vanishing from his pale face. I walked slowly, deliberately, down the length of the long mahogany table, holding the stunned gaze of every single relative who had slandered my name on social media over the past year. I didn't look angry. I didn't look defensive. I looked entirely, terrifyingly in control. "It is a beautiful story," I repeated, stopping directly across from my father and brother, placing the heavy portfolio on the table with a dull thud. "There is only one tiny problem with your eulogy, Richard. It is a complete, fabricated, criminal lie from start to finish." "Julian, how dare you?" my father bellowed, recovering from his initial shock. His face instantly flushed a violent, dangerous, mottled red. He slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, making the fine china coffee cups rattle aggressively in their saucers. "Have you absolutely no respect for the dead? You come into your own mother's funeral to cause a scene? You are a disgrace. I didn't bring legal transfer documents to a funeral luncheon, Richard. You did?" I replied, my voice dangerously level, completely unfazed by his manufactured rage. I didn't call him Dad. That privilege had expired the night they tried to extort me. I slowly unzipped the heavy black leather portfolio. The sharp, metallic sound of the zipper was the only noise in the completely paralyzed room. Every single aunt, uncle, cousin, and family friend was holding their breath, their eyes darting nervously between me and my father, completely captivated by the unfolding disaster. "You all heard the tragic story about Felix fighting for his life in the hospital 10 months ago," I said, turning my body slightly to project my voice clearly so the people in the very back row could hear every single syllable. "You all read Clara's dramatic Facebook posts about how I maliciously refused to pay $35,000 for his critical, life-saving surgery. You all left comments calling me a monster, a sociopath, and a greedy corporate suit." I reached into the portfolio and pulled out the first stack of papers. It was the official, stamped hospital records Beatrice had managed to secure for me, complete with the itemized billing statement. "This is the official medical discharge paperwork and the billing statement from that exact night," I said, tossing a dozen copies down the center of the long table. They slid across the polished wood, fanning out, stopping directly in front of my stunned, wide-eyed relatives. "I strongly encourage you to read it." Felix was in the emergency room for exactly 6 hours. He had a mild panic attack. The triage doctors gave him a generic anxiety pill and sent him home to rest. The entire medical bill was $800. There was no internal bleeding. There was absolutely no surgery. The $35,000 was a fabricated extortion attempt because Felix and Clara were 3 months behind on their residential mortgage and were facing imminent bank foreclosure. A collective, sharp gasp echoed through the room. My Aunt Beatrice, sitting near the middle of the table, eagerly picked up the paper closest to her, adjusted her reading glasses on her nose, and let out a loud, vindicated scoff that cut through the tension. Several other relatives scrambled to grab a copy, their eyes frantically scanning the medical coding, the discharge diagnosis, and the meager $800 total printed at the bottom of the page. "That's a lie," Felix shouted, his voice cracking with genuine, high-pitched panic. He pointed a trembling, accusing finger at me across the table. "He fabricated those. He printed them off the internet. He's trying to ruin my reputation in front of the family." "Your reputation is already bankrupt, Felix," I shot back, not breaking eye contact, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Just like your pathetic restaurant." Which brings me to the second part of Richard's little speech today. I reached back into my portfolio and pulled out the thickest, heaviest stack of documents. This was the kill shot. This was the moment I had waited 10 months to execute. Richard just asked me to sign legal transfer documents to graciously adopt the commercial real estate debt to honor my mother, I said, holding up the heavy legal packet so the entire room could see the official state seals on the cover. What he completely failed to mention to all of you is that I technically already own that crippling debt. Because 5 years ago, Richard and Barbara forged my signature on a commercial real estate deed to secure a massive federal bank loan to fund Felix's failing restaurant. The absolute shock in the room was palpable, heavy, and completely suffocating. It felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the space. My father opened his mouth to scream, to deny it, to call me a liar, but no words came out. His jaw just worked silently, opening and closing, his face draining of all color until he looked as pale as the corpse in the other room. "This," I said, slamming the stack of papers onto the table with a loud, authoritative crack that made several people jump in their seats, "is a comprehensive, 100-page forensic handwriting analysis conducted by one of the top expert witnesses in this state. It concludes, with absolute medical and legal certainty, that Barbara forged my signature on federal bank documents while Richard stood by as a witness. That is multiple counts of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and severe bank fraud." I started sliding thick copies of the forensic report down the table. My cousin Lucas, who had acted as their loyal spy, looked physically ill, staring down at the undeniable proof of my parents' criminality. Clara backed away from the table, her face completely pale, her eyes darting frantically toward the exit, clearly realizing that the entire financial house of cards she had married into was collapsing in real time. "I didn't abandon this family," I said, my voice rising just enough to command absolute, unquestioned authority over the entire room. "I survived this family. For 34 years, I was treated like a financial resource, a backup plan, an ATM machine for a golden child who has never taken responsibility for a single mistake in his entire life." I turned my full, unyielding attention back to my father, who was now gripping the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles pure white, his breathing shallow and incredibly rapid. The arrogant, grieving patriarch was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered old man. "You brought these transfer papers today because the primary cosigner on that fraudulent loan is dead, and the federal bank is coming to collect their money," I told him, stating the cold, hard facts with absolute precision. "You thought you could ambush me in front of an audience. You thought my grief, my shame, or my fear of public embarrassment would force me to blindly sign away my life to protect your favorite son one last time." I reached across the table and picked up the blank transfer documents my father had placed there earlier. I held them up high in the air so everyone could see them, and then, slowly, deliberately, and with immense satisfaction, I ripped them perfectly in half. The crisp sound of tearing paper echoed loudly in the silent room. I ripped them again, and dropped the pieces onto the floor at my father's feet. "I am not signing anything," I stated, my voice echoing with finality. "My corporate lawyer has already submitted the forensic evidence and the original forged deed to the federal bank's fraud department. They are currently unwinding the loan. The bank will be seizing the commercial property immediately. Felix, you are going to lose the restaurant by the end of the week. And Richard, since your name is also tied to the fraudulent accounts as a guarantor, the bank will be placing a massive lien on your residential home by the end of the month. You are both financially ruined." Felix let out a pathetic, strangled sob. His legs gave out, and he collapsed heavily into his chair, burying his face in his hands, weeping tears of absolute terror. He didn't look like a charismatic golden child anymore. He looked like a terrified, ruined little boy who finally had to pay his own tab. Clara didn't comfort him. She just stood there, staring at him with absolute disgust. "If any of you," I said, turning my gaze to slowly scan the faces of every single relative in the room, making eye contact with the aunts and uncles who had cursed my name, "ever contact me again. If you ever send me a message, tag me in a post, or show up at my corporate office, my legal team will file immediate, devastating civil harassment lawsuits against you. I have absolutely no family here." I zipped up my black leather portfolio. The silence in the room was absolute, total, crushing defeat. They had brought a guilt trip to a legal execution, and they had lost everything. I turned around and walked out of the heavy wooden double doors. I did not look back at the wreckage I left behind. I walked briskly through the quiet, carpeted halls of the funeral home, pushed open the heavy glass front doors, and stepped out into the crisp, bright afternoon sunlight. The air tasted incredibly clean, free of the stench of lilies and lies. For the first time in 34 years, the heavy, suffocating, toxic chain that had bound me to their manipulation had completely shattered into a million pieces. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The immediate aftermath of the funeral ambush was a masterclass in scorched earth legal warfare. My father, realizing that his complete financial ruin was entirely inevitable, tried one final, desperate, incredibly spiteful move to hurt me. 3 weeks after the dramatic confrontation at the funeral, I received a certified, formal letter from a high-end estate attorney. It turned out that my mother had a small, incredibly old life insurance policy worth exactly $15,000. For some unknown reason, likely an administrative oversight, she simply forgot to update over the decades. Both Felix and I were still listed as equal 50-50 beneficiaries. My father, acting as the executor of her estate, was actively contesting the inheritance distribution. He filed a formal legal complaint claiming that because I had abandoned the family in their time of need and caused his wife severe, fatal emotional distress, I had completely forfeited my legal right to any inheritance. He was desperately grasping at straws, trying to claw back any amount of cash to pay for the massive legal defense he was about to need to fight the federal bank fraud charges. I didn't even blink. I simply handed the certified letter directly to Harrison, my lawyer. Harrison made exactly 2 phone calls to the insurance provider's legal department. The life insurance policy was a legally binding federal contract. My father's deeply hurt feelings and entirely fabricated emotional distress claims were completely irrelevant in a court of law. The insurance company cut me a certified check for my half of the inheritance, $7,500, exactly 8 weeks later. I didn't keep a single dime of it. I endorsed the check and donated the entire amount directly to a national nonprofit organization that provides aggressive legal aid and housing to victims of family financial abuse. It felt incredibly poetic, almost beautiful, to use Barbara's money to systematically destroy people exactly like her. Meanwhile, my professional life skyrocketed to heights I had never imagined. The absolute, ironclad boundaries I had learned to enforce with my highly toxic family seamlessly translated into my corporate career. I no longer made myself small. I no longer apologized for taking up space in conference rooms. I no longer backed down when challenged. My department was assigned a new senior manager named Gregory. Gregory was a textbook corporate narcissist. He had a management style that uncomfortably, eerily mirrored my father's. He expected his employees to read his mind, took total credit for his team's major successes, and aggressively blamed his subordinates for his own strategic failures. In the past, the old Julian would have put his head down, worked 80 hours a week to cover Gregory's massive mistakes, and stayed completely silent to avoid any office conflict. The new Julian did not play those pathetic games. When Gregory attempted to present my highly complex, quarterly predictive analytics model to the CEO as his own original brilliant work, I didn't flinch. I waited calmly until the major executive board meeting. Right after Gregory finished his presentation, basking in the praise of the board, I calmly opened my laptop, projected the metadata and version history of the files onto the massive screen, and systematically, politely proved that I had authored every single algorithm while Gregory was on a golf trip in Florida. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call him names. I just presented the cold, hard facts. Gregory stammered, his face turning a deep, humiliating red, completely unable to defend the blatant intellectual theft. Victor, the CEO, saw exactly what was happening. 2 weeks later, Gregory was quietly forced into early retirement to avoid a corporate scandal. I was immediately promoted to the director level to replace him. The massive promotion came with a beautiful corner office overlooking the harbor and a staggering salary increase that completely secured my financial independence for the rest of my life. It was during this specific period of intense, incredibly rewarding personal growth that I finally met Diana. I wasn't actively looking for a romantic relationship. I was attending a quiet, upscale art gallery opening recommended by my therapist to help me cultivate hobbies and interests outside of the relentless corporate grind. Diana was standing in front of a chaotic, dark abstract painting, holding a glass of sparkling water, looking deep in thought. We struck up a casual conversation about how the artist managed to make something so visually aggressive feel incredibly peaceful and resolved. Diana was a fiercely intelligent, financially independent, and deeply grounded woman. She was a senior commercial architect who had fought her way through a very messy, highly contested divorce. Her ex-husband was a master emotional manipulator who had tried to use their 8-year-old son, Toby, as leverage during a brutal custody battle to extract alimony. Diana had fought like a lioness in court, secured primary custody, and rebuilt her life from absolute zero. We didn't immediately trauma bond over our dark pasts, but there was a quiet, profound, shared understanding between us. We both knew the exact, heavy price of freedom. We both knew what it meant to walk away from highly toxic people and rebuild your reality. Dating Diana felt entirely different than any relationship I had ever experienced in my 20s. It wasn't a chaotic roller coaster of high drama, screaming matches, and deep lows. It was incredibly calm. It was stable. It was deeply rooted in genuine, mutual respect and radical honesty. When I finally met her son, Toby, after 6 months of dating, I was incredibly careful. I didn't try to buy his affection with expensive gifts. I didn't try to play the cool stepdad. I just treated him like a human being who deserved respect and patience. We bonded slowly over building intricate, massive Lego sets on the living room floor on Sunday afternoons. Toby had a quiet, highly observant nature, and seeing him slowly open up to me, trusting me to be a stable, reliable presence in his life, healed a massive part of my inner child I didn't even know was completely broken. Back in the smoldering wreckage of my old life, the massive consequences of my family's actions finally caught up to them in spectacular fashion. The federal bank finalized the fraud investigation. Felix completely lost the restaurant. The massive commercial property was seized by federal marshals. The locks were changed overnight, and the assets were liquidated at a public auction for pennies on the dollar. Because the loan was originally secured through blatant forgery, the bank came down incredibly hard on my father as the guarantor. They placed a massive, crippling financial lien on his residential home, effectively destroying his retirement funds and erasing his entire net worth. The severe stress of the absolute financial collapse was the final nail in the coffin for Felix's marriage. Clara, realizing that the endless stream of money was permanently gone and the golden child was actually just a broke, unemployable fraud facing potential criminal charges, filed for a highly aggressive divorce. She took half of whatever miserable assets they had left, demanded full custody of their dog, and completely abandoned him to deal with the fallout alone. One freezing, rainy Tuesday night, about 14 months after the funeral, my luxury apartment building's intercom buzzed loudly. I walked over to the security screen mounted on the wall and looked at the live camera feed. Standing outside in the freezing rain, looking completely disheveled, soaked to the bone, and carrying a single, cheap canvas duffel bag, was Felix. He looked 10 years older. His hair was thinning, and he looked incredibly frail. He pressed the buzzer again, looking directly into the camera lens with desperate eyes. I picked up the intercom receiver. "What do you want, Felix?" "Julian." His voice cracked through the static speaker, dripping with absolute, pathetic desperation. "Julian, please. Clara kicked me out. Dad won't answer the phone because he's dealing with the bank lawyers. I have absolutely nowhere to go. My credit is completely destroyed. I have $20 in my pocket. Please, man. You're my brother. I just need a warm place to crash for a few weeks. I just need a small loan to get back on my feet." I stood in my warm, highly secure, beautifully furnished apartment. I thought about the text message he sent me at midnight all those months ago. "Hope you die alone, you pathetic loser." I thought about the forged signature on the real estate deed. I thought about the $35,000 extortion attempt disguised as a dying plea. "Your failures are not my responsibility, Felix," I said into the intercom, my voice perfectly steady, completely devoid of pity or hesitation. "You made your choices. You burned every single bridge you ever walked across. Go find another ATM. Julian, please. I'm begging you. I'm your family," he screamed into the rain, his voice breaking. "I don't have a brother," I replied. I hung up the heavy receiver. I didn't look at the security screen again. I walked calmly back into my living room, sat down on the comfortable leather couch, and opened a book. I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated peace. It has been 3 entire years since that freezing rainy night, and my life is entirely, wonderfully unrecognizable from the exhausted, defensive, terrified existence I used to endure. I am sitting right now on the plush, comfortable sofa of the massive, sunlit, 4-bedroom house Diana and I purchased together in a quiet, highly upscale neighborhood in the suburbs. The walls are covered in bright, vibrant artwork that Diana picked out. The massive, floor-to-ceiling windows look out over a beautifully landscaped, fenced-in backyard. Diana is in the spacious kitchen right now, laughing loudly at something on a comedy podcast while she preps fresh vegetables for our Sunday dinner. The incredible smell of roasting garlic, olive oil, and fresh herbs fills the entire house, making it feel like a real home. At my feet, a large, incredibly goofy golden retriever mix named Cooper is snoring softly, his heavy head resting affectionately on my expensive slippers. In the center of the living room, Toby is sitting cross-legged on the thick rug, intensely focused on building a highly complex robotic arm for his upcoming middle school science fair project. I spent 3 hours last night sitting beside him, helping him carefully solder the tiny electrical wires and testing the small motors. We didn't dip into any mysterious, stolen college fund to buy his expensive robotic supplies. We simply used our hard-earned salary to support his passions because that is exactly what a healthy, functioning parent does. You nurture the people you love. You invest in their future. You don't use them as collateral for your own selfish mistakes. My cell phone is sitting face up on the glass coffee table. It is completely, wonderfully, blissfully silent. There are no frantic, 3 a.m. phone calls demanding $35,000. There are no passive-aggressive, emotionally manipulative text messages threatening my peace of mind. There are no sudden, completely fabricated family emergencies deliberately designed to extract money, time, or emotional energy from my soul. I changed my phone number permanently 3 years ago. I deleted every single trace of my social media presence. I made myself an absolute ghost to the toxic people who unfortunately shared my DNA, and in doing so, I became completely, vibrantly alive to the people who actually mattered in this world. Aunt Beatrice still sends me a brief email maybe once a year, usually around the holidays, just to give me the broad strokes of the family fallout. I read them out of mild, highly detached curiosity, like reading a boring news article about a distant, chaotic country I never planned to visit again. My father never recovered financially from the federal bank seizing his assets. He was forced to sell the large, incredibly expensive suburban family house to satisfy the massive commercial liens generated by the forged documents. He avoided federal prison, but his life is a prison of his own making. He currently lives in a very small, incredibly cramped one-bedroom apartment on the dangerous outskirts of the city, working a grueling part-time retail job to supplement his absolutely decimated Social Security checks. He tells anyone who will listen that his ungrateful, greedy, soulless youngest son destroyed his life, refusing to ever take a single ounce of accountability for his own fraudulent, criminal actions. Felix's life followed the exact, highly predictable downward spiral of a classic narcissist completely stripped of his enablers. After Clara finalized the brutal, highly publicized divorce, Felix bounced from friends' couch to cheap motels, eventually taking a low-level, minimum-wage job washing dishes at a chain restaurant. The ultimate, beautifully poetic irony for an arrogant man who demanded to be the CEO of a fine dining establishment he never earned. He still posts incredibly dramatic, victim mentality quotes on his public social media profiles, but absolutely nobody engages with them anymore. The audience packed up, saw through the lies, and went home. I don't hate them. Hate requires massive amounts of energy. Hate requires a deep emotional investment that I am simply no longer willing to make. I look back at my past not with burning anger, but with a profound, quiet, immense gratitude for the brutal, necessary lessons it taught me. I learned the incredibly hard way that the family you are born into is just a random accident of biology. DNA does not automatically grant someone a permanent, all-access VIP pass to disrespect your boundaries, illegally drain your bank accounts, or completely manipulate your sanity. Loyalty that is demanded through guilt, threats, and manipulation is not loyalty. It is a psychological hostage situation. I spent the entire first 30 years of my life deeply believing that my fundamental worth as a human being was completely tied to how useful I could be to my family. I falsely believed that if I was just responsible enough, quiet enough, and low maintenance enough, they would eventually see my true value and love me the exact way they loved my golden child brother. I was completely wrong. Some deeply broken people will only ever view you as a financial resource. And the exact second you stop producing for them, the second you firmly close the vault, stand up for yourself, and say the word no, they will immediately brand you as a villain. Let them call you a villain in their fabricated, dramatic stories. Let them cry to the extended relatives and play the victim. Let them post their dramatic statuses on the internet. Because the absolute, beautiful, undeniable truth is that their toxic opinions hold absolutely zero weight in the real world. You are fully allowed to walk away from the table when mutual respect is no longer being served. You are allowed to aggressively, fiercely protect your peace, your hard-earned assets, and your beautiful future. I look around this bright, incredibly warm room. I look at Toby proudly holding up his finished robotic arm, a huge, genuine smile spreading across his young face. I look at Diana walking into the room, wiping her hands on an apron, her kind eyes meeting mine with absolute, unconditional warmth and love. I didn't die alone. I didn't become a pathetic, bitter loser like Felix predicted. I built an incredible empire of peace directly over the cold ashes of their manipulation. Have you ever faced something incredibly similar with your own toxic family? Have you ever had to make the terrifying, agonizing, completely necessary decision to completely cut off manipulative relatives to save your own life and your own sanity? It is one of the absolute hardest things a person can do, and society will often try to make you feel incredibly guilty for choosing your own survival over blood. But you are not alone in this fight. Share your story in the comments below. Let this beautiful community be a safe place where we fiercely validate the immense courage it takes to walk away from abuse. And please, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next incredible journey. Remember, your peace is not up for negotiation. Protect it at absolutely all costs.